5 mail-order brides were being sold off in a saloon, until a lonely rancher kicked down the door and changed everything. Who's next, Saloon? That one, Cuban, I think. Flexible as wet willow. Who'll open the bid? Laughter cracked like gunfire across the saloon, thick with cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. Men crowded shoulder to shoulder, their boots grinding sawdust into the floorboards, eyes shining with hunger that had nothing to do with food. Saloon Finch leaned against the bar like he owned the sun, a smirk tugging one corner of his mouth as he waved his hand lazily toward the stage. Isabel, he drawled, tapping the registry book with a stained finger. 22. Dancer from Havana. Legs for days and no complaints. Who'll start? A grizzled man holding a half-empty jug lifted his hand. 2 jugs of rye and a mule. Finch sneered. She ate a fence post. Let's not insult the lady. Isabel stood under the lamplight, her red dress torn at the hem, bare shoulders proud despite the bruise along her collarbone. Her eyes scanned the room, cold as the Gulf breeze, fixed on no one. The way she held her spine straight said she had survived worse than this crowd. Beside her stood 4 other women, each broken in a different way. Callie's arms were crossed, jaw clenched, her wrists still bearing the purple stains of rope burns. Her father had traded her to settle a debt at the poker table. Her stare promised hellfire. Naomi stood silent, hands clasped like in prayer. Her lips were dry and split, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken since her last husband tried to drown her in a trough and left her for dead. A long white scar ran beneath her chin. Joanne was older, plain as dishwater, with a nurse's apron still tied tight around her thin waist. She had been expelled from her wartime post for aiding wounded enemy boys. Now she stared at the floor, as if reading the names of the dead. And Ruth was the smallest, barefoot, tattered blue dress slipping from one shoulder. Her tangled hair looked as if it had never met a brush. Locals called her haunted, claimed she whispered to wind, and slept with her eyes open. Her gaze stayed fixed on the swinging doors, not pleading, not angry, just waiting. That was when they opened. The piano had gone quiet hours ago, but the thud of boot heels across wood drew every eye. A tall figure filled the threshold, long coat dusted with trail grime, hat shadowing his face. He moved like someone who didn't mind if he got shot, just preferred not to. Evening, Jeb Hawkins said. His voice was rough, like river rock rubbed smooth by years. Got a delivery in town. Thought I'd stop in for a drink. Finch chuckled, gesturing grandly. Well, Hawkins, you're just in time for the show. Pick your poison. Ladies tonight. Jeb didn't laugh. His eyes traveled to the women at the stage, resting first on Isabel, then Callie, Naomi, Joanne, and finally on Ruth. His brow twitched just a little. The girl was no older than 20, pale and shaking, her fingers wrapped around the frayed hem of her dress like a lifeline. A man behind Finch reached up suddenly, grabbing a handful of Ruth's hair. Let's see the teeth on this one, he jeered. Bet she bites. The shot cracked like lightning. The bottle in his hand exploded, spraying glass and whiskey across his shirt. He yelped, stumbled back. Smoke curled from the barrel of Jeb's revolver, which he had drawn so fast most men hadn't seen him move. Don't touch her, Jeb said quietly. The room froze. Finch blinked. You just shot a bottle, he said carefully. Not a man, so let's hope that was your warning. Jeb stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The floor creaked under his weight. I'm not here to bid, he said. Not here to bargain. Then why are you here? Someone spat. Jeb stopped just short of the stage. His eyes locked on Finch's. I'll take them all, he said. Every last one. The crowd murmured, a mixture of disbelief and derision. All 5? Finch raised a brow. You drunk or just foolish? Jeb reached into his coat. Slowly, no sudden moves, he withdrew a pouch and dropped it onto the bar. It hit with a dull, solid thunk. When Finch opened it, his smile faltered. Inside was silver, real silver, not coins shaved thin but full rounds, gleaming under the light. They're not cattle, Jeb said. They walk out with me. Now. No one moved. Finch stared at him, then at the women. Finally, Callie stepped down from the platform. Then Isabel, chin high. Naomi followed, trembling but steady. Joanne nodded once before joining them. Ruth hesitated. Jeb extended his hand. She took it. Her fingers were cold. And then they walked, past the stunned crowd, out into the cold breath of night. Stop them. Finch's voice bellowed behind them, thick with rage and ale. Get them back. I want that silver, or I want his scalp. Before the last syllable left his lips, Jeb had already turned. Move, he said low, and though his voice barely rose, it cracked like a whip through the air. The five women hesitated for the briefest of seconds. Then Callie grabbed Naomi's elbow. Joanne shoved open the side door near the bar, and they plunged into the night. Jeb covered their retreat, revolver still warm in his hand, boots pounding the wooden floor. Behind them came the scramble, Finch's hired men, two of them with rifles, another with a skinning knife, all grinning like the hunt had just begun. They burst into a narrow alley behind the saloon, moonlight slicing through gaps in the old buildings. Mud clung to their boots. A broken ladder leaned against the back of a butcher shop. Barrels lined the walls, reeking of fish and grease. "This way," Jeb hissed, leading them toward the abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. His hand swept low and sharp, signaling silence. The women followed, breath ragged, skirts soaked from puddles and filth. Inside the warehouse, the dark pressed in like a second skin. Jeb lifted a rusted latch, kicked open a back exit, and led them through stacked crates and old plows. Then came the shout there, in the alley. Gunfire cracked. A bullet snapped into the doorframe just as Isabel ducked past. Ruth screamed but kept moving, gripping Naomi's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Beyond the warehouse, a small gully cut through the dirt. Rainwater had carved a deep trench, slick and steep. Without hesitation, Jeb jumped first, sliding down and landing hard. "Down," he barked. Callie jumped. Then Isabel. Then Joanne, cursing under her breath. Naomi froze for half a second, glancing back. Ruth was still at the edge, trembling, too paralyzed to move. Naomi turned around, grabbed her wrist. "Now," she shouted, or tried to. The sound never came, but her eyes screamed it loud enough. Together they fell, tumbling into the muck below. Jeb looked up. His horse, tied near the barn earlier, had wandered close, startled by the gunfire. He ran for it, vaulted into the saddle, and turned to face the alley's mouth. Men spilled out from the warehouse. One fired, the shot skimming past Jeb's shoulder. "Keep going," he yelled back toward the women, who were climbing the other side of the ditch now, scraping knees and pulling skirts, Ruth being half carried by Naomi. Jeb kicked the horse into motion, riding at a diagonal to shield the group. With one hand he drew his second revolver, firing over his shoulder. The shots rang out, clean and practiced. One man ducked. Another fell backward into the mud with a scream. A barrel tipped ahead of Jeb. He leaned hard, arms scraping against the corner of a crate, wood splinters slicing into his skin. Blood bloomed across his sleeve. He did not slow down. The horse galloped ahead, hooves striking sparks from cobblestones. Behind them, shouts faded. Finch's men weren't prepared for a chase through a town that barely had a road. At the edge of a dried creek bed stood an old delivery cart, abandoned and half sunken in weeds. Jeb jumped off, guided the horse beside it. "In," he told the women, already clambering up to the driver's perch. Callie took the reins without being asked, surprising even herself. "I've handled worse things than mules," she muttered. The rest clambered in, Joanne first, then Isabel and Naomi, Ruth curling herself into the back. Jeb mounted behind, scanning the horizon. "Hold tight," he muttered. The cart creaked and lurched forward. Behind them no more gunshots, just the howl of wind and the scent of old rain rising from dirt. Naomi was still gripping Ruth's hand as if letting go would mean drowning. Their chests rose and fell in near unison, cheeks smeared with mud. Joanne wrapped her shawl around both of them. No one spoke. Jeb rode behind them on horseback now, his face unreadable, but his gaze never left the cart. He checked their count, 5. He checked for injuries, none fatal. His sleeve was soaked through, pain biting at his arm, but he made no sound. Just a silent nod to himself, and then to the road ahead. By the time they reached Jeb's land, the stars were high and windless over the horizon. The wagon wheels clattered over dry soil as they passed a split fence, two posts leaning like old bones. His ranch sat alone at the edge of nothing. No neighbors, no town lanterns, just a squat wooden house weathered gray by sun and silence. The cabin looked like it had stood through storms without flinching. A porch leaned slightly to one side. One shutter hung loose. But the windows were intact, the door strong, and there was smoke curling from the chimney, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and was only now exhaling. Jeb dismounted and opened the door without ceremony. "Ain't much," he said, voice low. "But it's dry." The inside was dim, lit by an old lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. There were two beds, one narrow cot in the corner, another larger but worn. A hearth sat cold and blackened, and against the far wall, a table scarred by knives and time. Shelves with chipped mugs, a water basin, a single mirror cracked in one corner. Callie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, measuring everything like she might need to break it someday. Joanne moved first. "It's clean," she murmured. "That's something." Isabel lit the fire with kindling she found in a tin near the hearth. Naomi and Ruth huddled close together near the wall. Jeb dropped his saddlebags by the door, pulled off his coat, and spread an old, faded blanket onto the wooden floorboards. He folded it once, then again, lay his coat on top as a pillow. Without a word, he sat on the edge of the hearth, wincing slightly. Joanne saw it. The way he tilted his shoulder, the stiffness in his right arm. "You're hurt," she said. "Nothing needs fussing over." She stepped forward anyway. "Sit still." He didn't argue. She peeled back his torn shirt and saw the raw scrape down his upper arm and shoulder, wood splinters, dirt, dried blood, clinging to bruised skin. He smelled like smoke and horse and desert wind. She cleaned it gently with a cloth soaked from the basin, then wrapped it in clean bandage from her old apron. "I've seen worse," she said softly, more to herself than him. He looked at her then, eyes steady. "You a nurse?" "Used to be," she answered. "Before they decided saving the wrong men meant I wasn't holy enough for the rest." He nodded once, said nothing more. Later, while the women found spots to sleep, some on the bed, some on coats laid out on the floor, Callie sat near the door, her back against the wall, arms across her knees. Joanne knelt beside her. "That man," she whispered, watching Jeb as he stoked the fire with his uninjured arm. "He's not like the others." Callie did not respond for a long moment, then muttered, "He's quiet." "That's rare." "Quiet's not the same as kind," Joanne said, "but sometimes it's close." Out on the porch, Jeb stepped into the still night, breathing in the scent of distant rain. Ruth followed him quietly, barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing over dust and dried grass. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The moonlight caught in her tangled hair, where bits of burrs and desert brush clung like remnants of escape. Jeb reached out, slowly, brushing the back of her head with fingers rough but gentle, pulling a thorn free. She flinched, but didn't move away. "Got caught in the misquite," he murmured. She looked up, met his eyes. They stood like that for a second, no longer stranger and fugitive, but something thinner, more human. The kind of pause that does not ask for words. Ruth blinked once, then stepped back inside. Jeb watched the door close softly behind her. He stayed out a while longer, listening to the wind carry coyotes' howls across the prairie, like a warning too tired to bite. Inside the house, no one cried, no one prayed. But for the first time, the silence did not feel like punishment. It felt like breathing. The sun rose slow that morning, casting a dull red haze across the plain, as if it had changed its mind about shining. Jeb was already outside, splitting wood with steady, deliberate swings when he spotted a rider far off, a lone figure raising a trail of dust atop a chestnut mare. He looked like any courier from town, but the tight grip on a folded letter, and the way his eyes darted to the house said something else. The rider dismounted stiffly near the old gate, boots crunching dry earth. "You Jackson Hawkins?" he asked. Jeb paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and nodded once. "Letter from the town council," the man said, his voice uneasy. "They're concerned about the women you got living here." Jeb didn't take the letter right away. "What kind of concern?" "They say it ain't proper, that you got no right keeping them. Some folks claim you stole them off Finch." "They're not property," Jeb said, voice low, steady. Still the courier continued, glancing nervously toward the porch. "They're talking about sending men. Law or not, when people get stirred up, things turn fast." Jeb finally took the paper but didn't unfold it. He looked toward the cabin. Naomi stood inside the doorway, half in shadow, eyes wide and unblinking like a deer smelling thunder. "Tell them we heard," Jeb said. "Tell them we're not hiding." The man gave a silent nod, mounted his horse, and rode back the way he came, faster this time. That night they read the letter by lamplight. Joanne held it with gloved fingers, careful not to crease it. The glow flickered across her face, casting shadows like cracks. "Return of unlawfully detained persons," she read aloud, each word like a nail. "Violation of community moral standards. Immediate compliance requested. Failure to comply may result in formal action sanctioned by church and civic authority." Callie stood up so fast her chair skidded back. "They call us detained," her voice cracked. "They want us to go back to that filth. To Finch?" "They don't see us," Isabel said, her tone bitter. "They see gossip, a stain on their prayers." Callie clenched her fists, pacing like a storm trapped in a small room. "Let them come. I'll show them what fear feels like." "No," Joanne said, rising slowly, her voice firmer than anyone expected. "That's not what we need." Callie turned to her, furious. "Then what? Sit still until they burn us alive?" "We don't need to burn anything," Joanne answered. "We need to exist, stay, live, quiet, visible, undeniable. That's how we fight." Later, Jeb sat on the porch sharpening his knife, each stroke a thought. Clouds rolled in from the west, thick with threat. He watched the tree line, senses open, waiting. Inside, Naomi checked every window latch. Ruth sat by the hearth, unraveling a thread with calm, precise hands. Isabel gripped a broom handle like a weapon. Joanne folded fresh bandages into a tin. Then came the scent, oil, sharp, wrong. Glass shattered in the back room. A shout from Callie. "Fire." They ran outside. Flames licked up the side of the old storage shed, fast and hungry. Behind the blaze moved shadows, men with torches, faces half hidden in smoke. Jeb did not hesitate. He ran for the flames. 2 attackers met him. One swung a rusted axe. Jeb ducked, slammed into the second, knocked him down hard. The axe came again. Jeb caught the handle mid-swing, twisted, punched, and drove his head into the man's nose. Blood flew. The second attacker clawed at Jeb's neck. Jeb turned, elbowed him sharply, and shoved him backward into darkness. A splash followed. The well. Then a scream. Ruth was being dragged across the yard, one man yanking her arm. She kicked, twisted, cried out. Isabel didn't think. She grabbed a broken post, charged and swung. The blow landed with a sickening crack. The man shouted, reeled back. Ruth fell to her knees. Naomi rushed to her, pulling her away. Smoke thickened. The attackers scattered. Jeb smothered the fire with a soaked blanket, stamping it out one spark at a time. When it was done, the shed was scorched but standing. They gathered on the porch, silent, breath ragged. Joanne wrapped Ruth in a coat. Callie's knuckles bled. Naomi gently wiped soot from Isabel's face. Jeb leaned on the railing, sweat and ash clinging to him. No one spoke. Inside, they left the door cracked open, just an inch. Not because they weren't afraid, but because fear no longer got to close the door. The bell tolled over town like a funeral march, slow, deliberate, drawing in the righteous and the curious alike. Word had spread quick. Finch was calling for justice, armed with papers and fire in his voice. He claimed Jeb Hawkins had unlawfully taken 5 women from his establishment and turned them into something indecent. The town called it a prayer meeting, but everyone knew it was more, an unofficial trial dressed up in scripture. By the time the first hymn should have started, the church was full. The pews groaned under the weight of folks who hadn't stepped foot in holy ground since Christmas. Pastor Lindley stood stiff behind the pulpit, looking more hostage than host, his hands gripping a stack of papers Finch had forced into them. Finch sat smug in the front pew, legs crossed, hair slicked, his best coat freshly pressed. He held a leather ledger against his chest like it was scripture. 2 of his bruised men, who'd failed to take the women back by force, flanked him, nursing silent grudges. Earlier that morning, he'd stood in the town square shouting, 1 man, 5 women. That's no homestead. That's a harem with better lighting. He stole them from my care and cloaked it in piety. Jeb Hawkins is no savior. He's a thief hiding behind kindness. The church doors creaked open one last time. Jeb walked in, dust on his boots, hat in hand, face unreadable. He didn't look at Finch. Didn't look at the crowd. Just took a seat near the back. The 5 women didn't follow him in, but the memory of their presence, of what they'd endured, hung thick in the air. Pastor Lindley cleared his throat. We've gathered today under concern. Allegations of unlawful detainment, of moral deviation. Mr. Finch believes his rights have been violated. Finch stood slow and theatrical. He held the ledger high, signed, sealed, witnessed. Those women were under contract, legal binding. I gave them shelter, food, work. He gave them lawlessness. The crowd murmured, torn between church manners and town gossip. Jeb stood, slow and sure. Where I come from, he said, voice carrying without effort, people ain't paper. Finch scoffed. Tell that to the 5 women sleeping under your roof. Jeb walked forward, stepped past the pews, and climbed the steps to the altar. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded sheet, and dropped it on the pulpit. The original contract. The very paper Finch was trying to weaponize. Paper doesn't save people, Jeb said, eyes steady. People do. Gasps fluttered through the room. Finch's face reddened. You don't get to decide what's legal. No, Jeb said, but I get to decide what's right. From the side door, Naomi appeared. She walked slowly, hands shaking just slightly, holding a small chalkboard. She stepped to the front and turned it around. Scrawled in white chalk were 4 words. Freedom does not ask permission. A hush spread across the congregation, thick as fog. Finch exploded. This is a circus. No, Joanne's voice came calm and strong from the back. The circus was yours. Selling fear and calling it safety. Calling it work. Calling it salvation. Finch turned, seeking allies. But heads lowered. Eyes looked away. No one stepped forward. Callie entered next, arms crossed, fading bruises still visible along her jaw. You fed us fear, she said clearly. He gave us firewood. That's the difference. Finch turned to Pastor Lindley. You're letting this stand? The pastor stared at the contract, then at Naomi's chalkboard, then at Jeb. Finally, he spoke. This church will not be used as a courtroom today, nor a cage. Finch's mouth tightened. His jaw twitched. He gripped the ledger tighter and stormed down the aisle, boots thudding against the wooden floor, echoing like judgment. He didn't look back. And though no one clapped, no one cheered, every soul in that room understood what had shifted. The women were no longer silent. And the town, for the first time, chose to listen. The days that followed the church meeting settled into a rhythm as steady as breath. No more torches, no more threats at the gate, only the low hush of wind sweeping across the plains, and the thrum of simple labor filling the spaces where fear had once lived. Jeb rarely spoke unless it mattered. He mended fences, hauled water, fed the hens before sunrise. But there were things he noticed, the way Ruth limped slightly when the weather turned, the way she always tried to walk behind the others, so no one would hear the drag of her heel across the floorboards. He said nothing of it, just watched. That evening, while the women were inside preparing supper, Jeb sat alone in the barn. Ruth's shoes rested in his lap, worn nearly through, soles flapping. One heel bent inward like it had long since given up trying to do its job. She had never complained, never asked for new ones, just kept walking. With the help of a small knife and a square of good leather from the tack box, Jeb reshaped the inner lining, added padding where her ankle rubbed raw, and reshaped the heel to balance her gait. His fingers moved slow but sure, not rushed. The kind of care that came from understanding pain you could not erase, only soften. He left them outside her door just before dawn. Ruth found them at sunrise. She bent down, fingers trembling slightly as she picked them up, then sat on the steps to slide them on. They fit not just her feet, but her, the way no gift ever had. She looked up. Jeb stood across the yard, feeding the horse, pretending not to watch. But when she turned fully toward him, shoes quiet on the porch, their eyes met. She didn't smile. She cried. Not loud, just enough that her shoulders shook. Callie, stepping outside with a basin of laundry, saw it. She paused mid-step, then turned back into the house, finding Joanne at the sink. She's crying, Callie said softly. Joanne wiped her hands on a towel. Ruth? Callie nodded. He fixed her shoes. Didn't say a word, just left them there like it was nothing. Joanne smiled faintly. To her, it's everything. She deserves it, Callie whispered. I just hope she believes that someday. Inside, Ruth sat for a long time, running her fingers over the stitches. Naomi passed by, paused, then knelt beside her. She did not speak. She only placed her hand gently on Ruth's shoulder and nodded once, slow and certain. Ruth leaned into the touch, like a bird finding a branch that would hold. That night, around the dinner table, the mood was quieter than usual, not somber, just full. Isabel hummed a tune under her breath, while stirring the stew. Callie mended a shirt at the corner of the room, her hands moving without hurry. Ruth kept glancing at Jeb, and Jeb, in his usual way, kept glancing back. No declarations were made, no love confessed. But when Ruth passed him the bread, their hands touched just long enough to say, I see you. I trust you. I do not need more than that. Later, after supper, Ruth lingered by the porch while the others cleared dishes. Jeb came outside with his coffee, sat beside her without invitation. The silence between them was not awkward. It was patient. Familiar. My mother used to say, he said at last, you can tell a man's worth by how he cares for things that can't speak. Ruth looked down at her shoes. They're not perfect, he added, but they'll hold. She nodded. They're the first thing that ever has. And in that moment something passed between them, not romance in the storybook sense, not fiery or urgent, but something truer. A promise without pressure. A feeling stitched together, quiet as the thread he'd used to make her shoes whole again. The wind returned that night with a sharp bite, curling across the hills like it carried warning. Jeb was checking the fence line. a gnawing feeling in his chest. From the porch, faint laughter spilled from the cabin, Ruth telling Naomi about stars that sang if you listened close enough. Then the horses stirred, stamping, snorting. Then the smell. Smoke. Jeb turned. Flames were crawling up the stable roof, crackling dry wood into fire. Black smoke spiraled skyward. From the tree line, shadows emerged, figures with torches, rifles glinting. Finch had come back. This time he brought war. Jeb ran. Inside, the women were already moving. Isabel grabbed a pail and shouted, "The horses." Despite her limp, Callie and Joanne ran for the well. Ruth screamed for Naomi, who had gone outside earlier and hadn't returned. Isabel vanished into the thick smoke. Inside the barn, a horse kicked wildly, trapped. Isabel coughed, struggling to reach the latch. A timber above her cracked. Jeb burst in, took the beam on his shoulder, shoved it aside. Isabel clutched the horse's lead, dragging it out with Jeb's help. She collapsed outside, soot-streaked, coughing. "I got him," she rasped. Joanne wrapped her in a blanket. Ruth had gone after Naomi, spotted her near the chicken coop, smoke rising behind her. Ruth ran, skirts catching on bramble. Then Finch stepped out of the smoke. "She belongs to me," he shouted, grabbing Ruth's wrist. She tried to pull back, but Jeb was already there, rifle swinging. It slammed into Finch's ribs. They hit the dirt, fists flying. Jeb fought with years of grief behind each blow. Finch punched back, split Jeb's lip, but Jeb did not fall. He tackled Finch, snarled, "You think you can buy people, then burn what you can't keep." Finch spat blood. "You think you're better?" "I don't think," Jeb growled. "I choose." Finch reached for a blade, but Jeb caught his wrist, twisted, and slammed him into the ground. He raised his rifle stock. Finch coughed, face pale. "Do it," he said. "Prove you're just like me." Jeb froze, then lowered the weapon. "You're not worth remembering." Behind him, Ruth and Naomi emerged from the shed. Naomi coughed hard, but she was safe. Joanne rushed to help. Callie and Isabel stomped out flames with wet blankets. The barn had burned, but it stood. Jeb dragged Finch to the edge of the ranch, tied him to his own horse. "You ride," he said, "and never come back." Finch didn't argue, just spat in the dirt and rode off. As dawn crept over the land, they stood in the ash, bruised, blackened, breathing. Callie sat beside Isabel, holding her hand. Joanne leaned her head briefly on Jeb's shoulder, then stepped aside so Ruth could come closer. No words, only breath, arms wrapped around one another. The barn had burned, but what mattered was still standing. Spring came slow that year, but when it arrived, it stayed. The ash from the fire had been cleared. New beams replaced the ones that burned. A fresh coat of whitewash covered the cabin walls. And yet, what had changed most wasn't the wood, or the roof, or the fields, but the people inside them. No one left. The women who had once sat silent on a saloon wall, waiting to be claimed like livestock, now moved through the ranch like they'd always belonged there. Because now they did. Ruth and Jeb were married one morning, just after sunrise. No priest. No audience beyond the four women who stood beside them, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright with something fierce and proud. Joanne held Ruth's bouquet, made of wild sage and dried wheat. Naomi braided a ribbon into her hair. Isabel played a slow tune on a borrowed fiddle, the bow light and careful. Callie stood beside Jeb like a second witness, nodding when he stumbled over the words. There were no rings, just one promise. Jeb took Ruth's hands in his, voice steady. "You don't belong to me," he said. "You are yours. And I'm lucky, because you chose to be near." Ruth smiled then, small but real, a smile that had never existed in the saloon, or under any man's claim. She leaned forward and kissed him, not with trembling, not with fear, but with the surety of someone who had found home. After the ceremony, life didn't slow, it deepened. Callie opened a saddle repair shop near the edge of town, close enough for customers but far enough not to hear the gossip. She worked with her sleeves rolled up and her chin high, teaching young boys how to knot leather and never apologize for being loud. Isabel turned the old granary into a dance room, just one mirror, one wooden floor. She taught little girls how to move their hips like wind and their hands like water. Her limp remained, but so did her grace. Naomi began visiting the schoolhouse, at first just to help sweep, then to teach a few signs to a mute child who stared more than spoke. Soon, the whole town knew how to say friend with their fingers. And Joanne returned to medicine, not under a banner, not in a uniform, but in the homes of women in labor and old men too proud to say they were afraid. They called her Doc Joe. She never corrected them. No one grew jealous. In fact, it was the opposite. They grew stronger in each other's victories. They laughed louder over stew, shared boots and secrets in silence like treasure. They were not wives. They were sisters. One evening, the table was full: bread, beans, roasted roots, and laughter. Naomi told a story with her hands, and everyone understood. Isabel teased Callie about the saddle order that had come in late. Joanne threatened to make everyone drink her bitter tonic. And Ruth, hair braided and cheeks flushed, leaned into Jeb's shoulder with the ease of someone who knew she'd never have to ask permission to do so. Jeb raised his cup, tapped it once against the table. "To peace," he said. They all nodded. Later that night, Ruth stood at the porch rail, looking out toward the ridge. The stars blinked, soft and distant. Behind her, Jeb joined her, quiet as ever. She didn't turn. "You still glad?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. "Then, every day. Because you're not mine. And I'm proud just to be near." Ruth looked at him then, eyes full. "That's what love is supposed to feel like, isn't it?" He nodded. "Not a chain. A choice." They stood together a little longer, listening to the wind curl through the grass like a lullaby. Tomorrow the horses would need feeding. The shed needed paint. And life would go on, not perfect, not easy but real. But tonight, they had each other. And that, in the soft hush of the morning light, was everything. Out here, in the dust and silence of the Wild West, not every story ends with fireworks. Some end with a quiet porch, the creak of a rocking chair, and the kind of love that grows from courage, not conquest. Jeb did not ride in to save anyone. He simply stood where no one else did, and made room for the broken to become whole again. If this story stirred something in you, if you believe love can bloom even in the hardest places, then saddle up and join us for more. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale is born from dust, danger, and devotion that defies the odds. Until next time, ride safe, and love even safer.